It's my privilege to introduce Josh Benjamins, who is remind me, you're a fourth year again?
Yes.
Yeah, so a fourth year graduate student at UC Berkeley in the classics department. And he's focused on the Church Fathers. And so without further ado, actually another thing that I want to mention that's very important is that Josh is a fellow Canadian.
Indeed.
That's very important. Can't leave that out.
Yes.
Okay. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Josh.
So first of all, thanks to Vanna and Darren for the invitation to give one of these Square Inch seminars. I think many of you will share my sense that as a grad student, one of the questions you get most often asked is, what are you studying? Or if you've passed qualifying exams, what is your dissertation on? Or what is your research on? I can't say how many times I've been asked that question. But in thinking about what to contribute for this talk, I found myself reflecting instead on a different set of questions. Why do I study what I study? And maybe also, how do I study what I study? And those are questions that I don't get asked nearly as often and haven't thought as deeply about. So tonight I'll try to begin to offer some answers to those questions as some sort of tentative first formulations towards a kind of apologia or explanation for what I'm doing as an academic and as a Christian. I vividly remember a seminar I was in where the professor in this classics seminar raised the question of what motivates us to study what we study. And I vividly remember a fellow grad student saying that she wouldn't be able to explain why she studies what she studies, and was terrified and frightened by the thought that a student might ask her that question and she'd be left in this kind of aporia. So I hope not to find myself in that predicament, but the perspective I'm giving here is kind of a provisional one. So I welcome your pushback and questions at the end. So as Darren said, I'm in the Department of Classics here. Classics is an unusual and almost a unique discipline in that it's defined primarily by a geographical area and a chronological time instead of a distinctive body of knowledge or even a particular methodology of inquiry. So broadly, it's Greco-Roman languages and culture, but that includes a lot of things, a lot of possible lenses to interrogate that time period and culture. That might include philosophy, religion, literature, politics, art, archaeology, linguistics. All of these can fall under classics. So I'm primarily an ancient historian, and specifically an historian of the later Roman Empire, let's say roughly 300 to 600 AD. And a large part of what I research and write on is Christianity in late antiquity, which makes it in some ways easy and in some ways hard to do this talk on how my research relates to Christianity and faith. I would say I consider myself a Roman historian primarily and not a Christian historian, whatever that might mean. But I'm going to focus for the sake of this talk on that aspect of my research, Christianity, and reflect a little bit, hopefully, on what it might mean to be a Christian who's also an historian of Christianity. So I'm going to, 20 minutes is a short time. I can't go through everything I had wanted to, but I'll say a little bit about how I came to be interested in what I do, the kind of history that I work on, and then I'll give a little bit of reflection perhaps on what it means to do history and what history is, and then end with some reflections on what it means to write the history of Christianity, and to do that as a Christian. So a bit about how I came to what I do. In high school, I was very interested in philosophy and theology, and especially systematic theology. I read a lot of systematic theology. I read John Calvin and John Owen and Charles Hodge and the Puritans, and also a lot of Christian apologetics, rational defenses and explanations of the Christian faith of various stripes. And theology has very much to do with norms, that is to say standards. Theology seeks out and articulates norms of belief and norms of practice. And theology, and also philosophy, which I was very interested in, asks the question, what is true? Or even maybe more fundamentally, what is truth and how do we know it? And then theology and philosophy both argue for the claims that they make. And so both are in the business of constructing a kind of logical edifice of sorts. interlocking truth claims that are then buttressed by evidence, whether that's reason or scripture or something else. In college, I became much more interested in history. And the thing that struck me about history was something that a good friend of mine, who was a history major and a fellow Christian as well, said to me my freshman year when we were talking about the history major, and something that I've thought a lot about since. And he said, when you're an historian and when you're thinking as an historian and writing a history paper, you need to bracket the question of truth. The question, is this true? Or do I agree with what I'm writing about or not? Veritas means truth, and all of us are invested in the pursuit of truth as Christians who believe that Christ is the truth with a capital T. And, I guess we're also all invested in truth as people who are in the academy and who are in the business of pursuing truth in some sense, whatever that might look like in our discipline. But the historian is not in the business primarily of assessing the truth of the systems of thought or belief or writings that he examines. That's not in his purview. And that's an important thing to keep in mind especially when you're doing intellectual history or the history of ideas. And that's the kind of history I became very attracted to in college as someone who had always been interested in ideas. And it's the kind of history most of my professors were engaged in and that I still do a lot of. So the historian of ideas, whether that's ideas of philosophy or theology or science, asks fundamentally different questions than the philosopher or the theologian or the scientist or even the philosopher of science. And his question is not primarily, is this idea or this claim true? Or even primarily, is this argument or this system logical or self-consistent or sound? But instead, he or she asks questions like, how did this idea arise? And how did these ideas combine and influence one another? Or how do the ideas of this individual relate to those of this sect or school or social group or society at large? How do new ideas arise? How are they articulated? How do they spread? How do they gain adherence? What motives lie behind them? How do they get interpreted or misinterpreted by other people? And again, those ideas can be philosophical systems, they can be religious dogmas, they can be scientific theories, or they can even be something much more ill-defined and sort of diffuse in the culture at large. And so to ask and to answer those questions is difficult in a different way, and it requires a particular kind of discipline and disciplined inquiry. So as I said, it requires you to bracket for the moment the question, is this true? And it also demands, intellectual sympathy, by which I mean the ability as much as possible to stand in someone else's shoes intellectually and to look at the world through their eyes and ask what that might mean. And that's something that I find tremendously exhilarating and rewarding as an historian, and that attracts me a lot to what I do. And this is where my reflections become introspective a bit, because I ask myself, what is it that made me turn away from the study of theology and philosophy to this interest that I have in history, and what changed about my ideals and my goals such that I made that turn. I've always been interested in theology and philosophy because I've always been drawn to ideas, and especially to what we sometimes call the big questions, the questions of truth with a capital T, questions about man and God, being and existence and nature and so on. Truth in the broadest sense. And I'd like to say that the reason that I study history and am attracted to history is in fact the same reason. It's a desire to interrogate those same big questions, conceptions of truth and goodness and beauty and all the rest. So what I think has changed then is really my perspective on truth, or at least the truth of ideas. So let me try to explain a bit what I mean by that. What the study of history has impressed on me deeply is that all ideas and all theories and all edifices of thought are inescapably conditioned by the circumstances of their production and their producer, even at the most basic level. Our language itself, the way that we use words and interpret words, even in the voiceless depths of our minds, all of that is shaped by our position in space, in time, in a certain cultural context and subculture, as people with a particular history and a particular circle of acquaintances and a particular education and formation and particular kinds of exposure to the world and so on. And what the study of history does, especially intellectual history again, is to bring those conditions and that conditioning to light. No idea comes into the world ready-made, as it were. It's always the product of a kind of gestation, if you will, in a certain context. And so what the study of history does for me is to relativize our ideas and my own ideas, whether those ideas are theological doctrines or kind of general beliefs about the world, or even presuppositions about reality that all of us take for granted without even realizing it, maybe simply because they're embedded in our language, which carries with it a kind of idiom by virtue of the way that language itself divides up the things that we see and experience around us. Now, relativism and relativize are scary words in a lot of Christian circles. So just to clarify what I'm saying, to say that an idea is relative to the context of its production isn't to say that all ideas or theories or doctrines or formulations of truth have an equal standing, or that their validity is just a function of their circumstances and who's looking at them. But it's just to say that all ideas and truth claims have a context, right, apart from which they're not fully intelligible. And that includes the most abstract and universalizing and grand claims that we might make about ourselves and the world and about God as well. And so to me, what that means is that before we can even properly do this exciting work of evaluating and assessing and adjudicating truth claims or ideas or systems of one kind or another, the lens of the historian is kind of indispensable for us. In the mind of God, ideas are timeless and unchanging, but in our shifting world, all of our ideas are conditioned by time. And so the task of the historian, as I see it, is, in some ways a precondition for someone who wants to be a seeker of wisdom in the intellectual legacy of the past. Okay, so that's a bit about why I came to history. And now a couple thoughts about what history is. The job of the historian in the most simple terms is just to tell a story. The historian's really a storyteller. I, as an historian, am a storyteller. And I suppose all of us as human beings are storytellers by predilection, as it were. And maybe being storytellers is, in fact, one aspect of what it means to be made in the image of God. Although it's also the peculiar lot of us as human beings whose existence is distended in space and time, as Augustine, whom I love, would love to point out to us. We tell stories because our lives are stories in a way. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end, unlike God's life, which is outside of time. And that's one reason why I've always been a little uncomfortable with the kind of jejune definition of history as his story, meaning God's story. So historians are storytellers, and they tell stories about the past, about other people and in other places and other times. And that, of course, involves study. The Greek word historia originally just meant inquiry or investigation. Today, we would probably say research. But there's more to history than just research. There's a myriad of highly contingent decisions that you make in telling a story, like where do you begin the story? Where does the story begin? Where does the story end? What events count as important in the story? Or even what is to count as an event or an action? How do you define your object of inquiry? What is an historical change and what factors are sufficient to account for it? And those are all the tough decisions that you have to make as an historian in the stories that you tell and the way that you choose to frame the story. There's also, I think, a kind of moral imperative, you could say, to the job of the historian, which is that the historian is out to tell a true story, which means, I guess, a story that is faithful to the past so far as we can trace it and reconstruct it. And that means not committing the sins of either commission, which would be telling a falsehood, or omission, which would be leaving out things that are important in the story. So the historian is not to pick and choose the facts in a perverse way. Of course, there's always a kind of principle of selection, which it can be hard about being an historian, but that's the kind of ideal that I seek to approximate as an historian. Okay, so a couple thoughts about what it might mean to write the history of Christianity as a Christian. One of the most influential books that I've read about history is a book that was written in 1931 by Herbert Butterfield called The Whig Interpretation of History. And in this book, Butterfield puts forward the view that Whig historians, referring to the British political party, are guilty of writing histories that favor progress and revolution. And he says that the same error often afflicts historians of religious conflict who tend to privilege Protestants, for example, because they are seen as more progressive than Roman Catholics. And there's almost a moral impulse in a lot of history writing, and that's hardly less true today than in the past, even though it's not so obvious all the time, to tell stories that favor or exalt progress and revolution. And in that process, to be continually passing judgment on the past from the perspective and based on the standards of the present, or of some other later and supposedly more enlightened age. So, you know, seeing a line of continual progress toward the glorious present. This is something that C.S. Lewis talked about as presentism, this assumption that the present is inherently superior to the past. And an allied error to that might be providentialism, by which I mean seeing the indelible hand of God at work in bringing some historical movement to successful fruition. A lot of histories about the American founding have been written in this way and are still written that way. So, as I said, I work largely on the early church, or more accurately, the late antique church and late antique Christianity. And one might wonder whether the history of the church is a kind of special case, you know, relative to history in general. Is there a special way to write and tell and record the history of the church? The church, of course, exists in time, like everything else. But we know from Matthew 16, for instance, that Christ is the one who is building the church in time and who is guaranteed that the gates of hell will not prevail against it until the end. So we might think that this particular segment of history that we call church history is a sort of specially privileged strand, and that we can trace God's providential hand as we look at the fortunes of the church through the ages and see its resilience in the face of all opposition and so on. And indeed, a lot of the popular church histories that I read and heard in my household growing up were written in this way, where, you know, each episode in the history of the church, from the martyrdom of Polycarp to, you know, the tenaciousness of Athanasius in the face of the Arians in exile, to St. Patrick's ministry to the Irish, and so on, is couched in this explanation of how God is directing each element of this event for the strengthening and formation of the church. And then the same is often applied to the Reformation, usually with the Middle Ages kind of conveniently bypassed so that we can skip ahead to the reappearance of light and truth out of the occlusions of darkness and lethargy in the meantime. And then the heroes are, you know, Luther with his hammer, and Calvin dictating treatises from his sickbed, and Ulrich Zwingli, the martyr in battle, and so on. And to me, all of that is a manifestation of this impulse that we all have in telling the story of the past, to frame it in terms of winners and losers, or heroes and villains, or maybe in this case, saints and heretics, or saints and sinners. And even though we acknowledge that the saints are sinners as well, there still tends to be this, this polarity in the way that we tell the story of the church. So I raise this question, is the history of the church a providential history? And there's an ambiguity in that question, of course, because history can mean more than one thing. So maybe it'll help to rephrase the question a bit. If the question is, does God sovereignly and providentially superintend and orchestrate the development of the church? Then on the basis of our faith, we resoundingly say, yes, he does. But if the question is then, should we write the history of the church in a way that as it were, unveils the providential hand of God operating at each step beneficently, then my thought is that we shouldn't. And here's where I'll end with just perhaps a cautionary tale from my own research. My dissertation is on competing visions of the ages of the world and the eternity of the Roman Empire in late antiquity and the late 4th and early 5th century. So I'm interested in how did Romans of this time, both Christians and pagans, assess the shape of history and their place in it and the future eternity, as it were. So the 390s AD was a great time to be alive if you were a Christian. The Emperor Theodosius presided over this unified empire of East and West, and in the year 380, he had made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire. And so this Christian poet Prudentius, writing in the Theodosian age, wrote this grand poem called Against Symmachus that brims with the optimism of a Christian triumphalism. And he sees how this Roman peace that he's living under, in that Roman peace, both Rome's destiny and sort of the Christian destiny are united, as it were, in kiss. And so he says, quote, "The world receives you now, O Christ, the world which is held in bonds of harmony by peace and by Rome. These you have appointed to be the chief and highest powers in the world. Nor does Rome please you without peace." So this idea that God has orchestrated things so that in this historical moment with the flowering of the empire, Christianity finds its denouement, as it were. And Augustine of Hippo expressed similar thoughts and sentiments in the 380s. You know, he saw God's hand at work in the spread of the Christian faith and the toppling of pagan altars and images. And he saw in this the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies like Psalm 72, "All kings of the earth shall serve him and all nations shall fear him." But then came 410 when the Goths under Alaric sack Rome, and Roman eternity turns out to be a bit of a myth, and suddenly the empire is very frangible if you're living in 410. And we can see Augustine changing tone after 410. And, you know, the Christianization of the empire loses a lot of its significance for him. Augustine had long thought about the history of the world in terms of 7 stages corresponding to the 7 ages of human life in Roman culture. And before 410, he often talked about the last age before the 7th one, which is the eternal Sabbath in heaven, as being the age of the Christian empire that he was living under. But after 410, he increasingly uses the term Christian times to refer instead to the whole period since the incarnation of Christ, with no special subdivision for this Christian empire. And so in his vision now, you know, the 6th age, the age of the church that we're living in now, doesn't have any special subdivisions or landmarks by which we can judge our place that serve as like revelatory clues of where we are in the 6th age and what's about to happen. Only at the last judgment, he says in City of God, will everything be made plain. And in the meantime, good and evil are inextricably mingled. That's our human lot. And that's the curse of the historian too. So this change in Augustine's theology, his theology of history or his philosophy of history, was in large part, I'm suggesting, a product of like new circumstances. It was what he thought about history and the theology of history was shaped by the contingencies of his historical experience. But I think that there is an insight here too in this mature vision of Augustine for how we think about telling the history of Christianity in the age of the church. And I think that as Christians, although we can see and acknowledge God's providence in the history of the church, as in all that happens by his orchestration, we should also beware of the danger of presuming too easily to identify his hand and locating ourselves too precisely at one historical moment or another in that plan.